everybody. Welcome. It's great to see so many friendly faces and also faces who are becoming friendly to me. My name is Caroline Sibley. I'm an assistant teaching professor of Arabic in the Department of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies. This lecture series tonight is part of an annual lecture series that the Center for Middle East and Islamic Studies runs on an annual basis. And every year, they invite a professor in to choose a different topic of study that's happening in the Middle East or Islamic worlds. And this year, our topic is diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility in Middle East languages and also just in general, because it's really important and interesting. So tonight, we are really excited to welcome Dr. Yasin Tunç from Portland State University, but originally all the way Wisconsin, Madison, East Coast, Turkey before that. He's currently an assistant professor of the practice in the Department of Curriculum and Instruction at Portland State University. He received his PhD from the University of Wisconsin in Madison in curriculum theory and comparative and internal education. And now he actually teaches in the MA and MS program and graduate teaching education program in the School of Education at Portland State University. So a lot of his work is in working with teachers who are teaching world languages and how do we make that instruction better, more equitable, more just, more accessible, more diverse, all of the DEIAs. So it gives me great pleasure to invite Dr. Yasin to speak with us tonight. Let's give him a big round of applause.
Thank you so much, Caroline. And I really want to start with just thanking you and how much I appreciate you for making this happen. And we talked about it before. Sometimes I feel like traveling now is, we have these virtual options, obviously, yeah. But I do like traveling, and I do like not just as a kind of a pleasure, yeah, but kind of a reorientation or a sense of, or the term that I want to use is a disorientation, and that when you're traveling, yeah, that is, and that's something I'll talk about. That feeling of disorientation is also at the very core of learning. Yeah, education psychologists use the term disequilibrium. Yeah, so traveling and meeting you all in person. Obviously, we have people who are joining us virtually too. So yeah, and I appreciate that, Caroline, and I appreciate all the things the things you did to make this possible. And I appreciate you all for being here, for being in the space to listen to and actually have a conversation about some of the things that I will talk about. And I hope that the things that I'll be talking about are not necessarily sort of intellectual ideas, yeah, but they're also ideas that really relate to my practice as a teacher, as a learner of English, as a learner of languages, as a teacher of languages, and also as a teacher trainer. Yeah. So what I will talk about is necessarily a question of practice, a pedagogical question as well. When I was contacted by Caroline to do some work in Turkish, I was doing two projects. One of the projects with a colleague at Agnes Scott College, we were trying to understand how world language teachers conceptualize this notion of culture. Yeah, it is kind of at the core of language teaching. So we're trying to understand, how do language teachers conceptualize culture? How do you select a cultural product? Yeah. What are the steps or the criteria for representation of a particular aspect of the culture? So that was one thing that I was doing. Another thing I was doing at the same time was sort of critiquing the secular historiography of higher education and education in large in Turkey. So this sort of became an opportunity for me to bring the secular aspects, the critique of secularism, and the culture from world language education. So what I'm going to talk about, hopefully, is just that bringing these two concepts together. So my topic is, my title is Secular Imagery and Imaginary in World Language Education, Critical Analysis of Cultural Representation in world language teacher practices and curricular materials. What I'm going to do is actually have a few quick discussion questions for us. And after that, we can, I'll share some of my analysis. So this is an image of a Turkish family at dinner. And so I'm going to ask you first to talk to the person next to you. First, what do you see in the picture? Now, world language teachers, we do picture talk a lot, yeah?
We do.
So let's do a quick think, pair, share. So turn to the person next to you. What do you see in the picture?
What's your name?
And if you're joining virtually, you can use the chat box.
I'm all alone.
That makes sense. Great to have you here. It's wonderful.
Or not a family, but people potentially.
That's amazing. Okay, so what do you see in the photo? That actually kind of, I don't know. She's sort there.
It looks like there's like hummus maybe.
I think I see a basket of bread. Right, so I'm wondering in my mind, I'm like, it's bread, like I'm part of Turkish culture. That's what I'm wondering, right? When I see that shit. Okay, what else?
They're two of them look older.
I'm seeing people, I think I'm seeing a lot of different goals, right? So like sharing
The women is
might
looking
be an
directly.
important thing, right? Like at my table growing up, right? Like I had my plate, mom had her plate, dad had his plate, like maybe there was a basket of bread, but everything else was we had our plate. And this seems like they're passing everything around and sharing.
Multi-generational in the photo, so maybe a father,
Okay,
daughter,
Parents.
some boots.
Okay, cool. Let's see. If she's wearing a dress, I see the two dresses,
So if you're ready,
short sleeves.
we can move on to the next slide. My next slide is just looking at this picture itself, what kind of generalizations, stereotypes, and biases do you think students can develop, yeah? So just that image itself, yeah? An image is a representation, obviously. And when I talk about images, obviously it's not just a singular image. I will talk about mobilization of multiple images. That's when image becomes more than just representing reality, it becomes reality itself. So the question is, again, like, if you were a student, yeah, what kind of generalization would you potentially develop out of this?
Yeah.
Oh, is this turn and talk?
Yeah, it's still, yeah. it
Be
is,
fair, sure, okay. all
Be
right.
fair, share,
Turn and talk.
turn and talk, yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's a nicer thing.
People are.
Okay.
Yeah.
But I see, like, okay, I'll tell you what I think and you tell me if you think it is a stereotype in Turkey.
Yeah.
Turkish people, all have money. Because they're eating on they're like wooden chairs, white tablecloth, big.
I mean, men are sitting on one side.
All Turkish people have money.
They're-
Yeah, they all seem to be dressed well. They're
No.
Sorry, you guys.
Okay.
on the table.
Right. Doesn't seem like a casual.
Yeah, not that much. Some people really
They
like
refuse to talk to each other.
Yeah. There you go.
Okay,
Well,
Yeah.
the guy.
my family.
No, they don't,
Tables.
except for her. She's got that big smile on.
yeah. Is there kind of like a
Yeah.
special like area on the ground, like pillows and or carpets or?
Not necessarily, sure. Turkish families would not be.
Oh, nice.
I don't
I
necessarily.
like it.
know.
Okay, my other stereotype is,
This definitely.
so I know Turkey is a Muslim
Is it
country,
personal?
but no Muslim women in Turkey wear hijab. That's my stereotype.
No, don't.
Hijab, head covering.
Would anybody be willing to share some of the, again, so if you have to think about this image presented to learners, yeah, language learners, yeah. most times, this kind of picture talk is really done at the elementary level. What are some sort of generalizations or biases do you think students could develop out of this?
Just off the bat, it seemed like it's like a nicer looking dining room home, so maybe their socioeconomic status is a bit higher, perhaps.
Yeah, so it's more like a middle class,
Yeah.
upper middle class environment, okay? Any other thoughts?
So I know Turkey is a majority Muslim country. So if I'm assuming that these people are Muslim, no Turkish women wear hijab. That might be the assumption I make.
Okay. If that is the presentation of one of the pictures that you were seeing right
Right.
now, yeah,
Yeah.
okay. All right, any other thoughts? Again, pictures or images do not act alone, yeah? They act collectively and they act on you. That's something that I'll talk about. How about this? And this is a question. It's also, the question is, what can teachers do, or language teachers do, yeah? To help students develop that kind of intercultural understanding and consciousness and minimize the biases, yeah? So I'm showing these pictures as alternative ways of imagining what a family or family like. Yeah, this actually is more like my experience than the previous one. Yeah, and then you have images like this that wouldn't necessarily fit in very well into a framework that you might have for a family. So we'll turn this into a question later after the presentation itself. Yeah. Now here again, another thing about images. Images are not just representation of the reality, they will construct the reality itself. So they become constituent in a sense. And obviously images, they don't work alone, they work with narratives too. Yeah. So it is one of the things I'll be talking about is the combination of narrative, that is the language, that is the vocabulary, and the images, and those construct a reality. Yeah. And as teachers, part of our job, especially world language teachers, is to critique or to criticize or to help our students to develop what I call a intercultural consciousness or a comparative consciousness to minimize these potential biases that our students could develop. So I'll have some discussion questions after the fact. In a recent study with a colleague at Agnes Scott College, we investigated world language teachers' understanding and perceptions of the status and role of cultures in world language teaching, their understanding of intercultural competence, interculturality, how world language teachers select cultural practices, products, perspectives, how they make these practices, products, perceptions, principles pedagogically accessible or teachable in their classrooms. In a sense, we inquired into one of the foundational, yet I think it is still a less questioned issues in world language education, what some have called the problem or the crises of representation. Our goal was to explore the intricate interplay between cultural representation, power, and language pedagogies. I'll share some of the findings from the study itself as they relate to this particular talk, but I wanted to share the starting point for my study. I was the lead instructor and curriculum developer for an immersive summer program for Turkish and Chinese languages at Agnes Scott College. And as a part of the program, we would have these daily reflective sessions at the end of each day for about 30 minutes. It was a space for our teachers and teacher assistants to share aspects of their teaching and some of the challenges they encountered. One thematic exploration that resonated throughout the summer was the intricacies of curriculum development, yeah? How one comes to choose curricular themes, how one chooses images, culture practices, perspectives, products to quote unquote contextualize language. And how do we do it in a way that serves the young people of every walk of life in our classrooms? We grappled with questions surrounding the choices we make in shaping our curricular topics and themes. Our discussions delved into complexity of various family structures, the realities of single parent households, for example, yeah, it sort of challenges this notion of what a family is. Families with gay and queer parents, those follow various cultural and religious traditions, including Muslim and conservative Christian families, and the kids, obviously, who come from these families. We had conversations about kids with single parents and implications of that for curriculum making, yeah? As we know, family is still one of those big topics in world language education. And most times we have this image of a happy nuclear family. Or if we have extended family, it's typically like a nostalgic image of an extended family. And then, of course, we had kids with gay or queer parents. One of our teacher assistants, who later became one of our main teachers, identified as queer. We have Muslim kids in our classrooms. So how do we position curriculum making in this complexity? What does this all imply for how we come to position the role of culture in curriculum making? Whose culture are we talking about when we say culture in the first place? In the process, we didn't find any easy answers, but we did create that reflective space that encouraged critical inquiry and reflection. For me too, this experience became a sort of critical juncture of self-reflection. I reflected on the cultural images, narratives, practices embedded in my Turkish curriculum, and I started asking questions about what biases, ideas, ideologies were informing my choices, and how these choices shaped the narrative of Turkey, or Türkiye now, we were presenting and representing to our students. And a significant moment of realization for me was when I was actually reflecting on the images and narratives in my curriculum, and I realized that most of what I am presenting is an image of a modern, westernized, secular version of Turkey that barely acknowledged the predominance of Islam, both as a religion and cultural frame of reference for most people in Turkey, yeah? Even those who identify as secular Muslims. Our curriculum featured icons such as Orhan Pamuk, Sezen Aksu, the singer-composer, Cem Yılmaz, comedian, Fazıl Say, the pianist and composer, Elif Shafak, most of whom are from Istanbul, representing a more secular and upper middle class habitus and habitat, while neglecting the inclusion of voices from more conservative working class environments and neighborhoods. Obviously, these people are not ideologically aligned per se. They're not a homogeneous group of people, yeah? Yet in their outlook, at least they still represent a secular Muslim identity. Nowhere in our curriculum did we include people like İsmet Özel, Necip Fazıl, these are more conservative literary people. We juxtaposed Kapalı Çarşı, the Grand Bazaar, and Sultanahmet Camii, the Blue Mosque, in the same instructional presentation, highlighting the architectural structure of these two iconic and popular monuments of the Ottoman architecture. And you could see the bewilderment in our students' eyes, not unlike a tourist visiting these buildings for the first time. For us and for our students, Blue Mosque, the Sultanahmet Camii, was an architectural icon. There was nothing in our presentation that referred to Islam, Islamic rituals performed at the mosque, the prayers, the salah, or how Muslims relate to mosque or masjid as a space, the sacred space, yeah? These would only take place as side conversations in the margins of our teaching when our students were to ask, and some of our students were middle schoolers, by the way, they would ask, what is a mosque? And I do remember vividly one of my Somali American student, a Muslim student, asking, is Turkey not a Muslim country? In a tone that was both out of curiosity and perplexity. And this was not during that first class either. So then what Turkey or Turkey were we presenting, representing, or imagining? What culture narratives were presented and what culture narratives were silent in our curriculum that resonated what I call kind of a particular vision of Turkish modernity? And the reason I ask this question is not necessarily a plea for inclusion of religious or religiosity as content or topic to teach. I have a problem with that inclusive mindset or inclusion in the first place, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But to really problematize and question about the very possibility of communicative action or communicative competence by excluding the religious realm, by decoupling it from the cultural. So is it possible to have that communicative action in Habermasian or in whatever other, in world language education, whatever sense you use the term, yeah? Is it possible, is the communicative action possible by excluding the religious from that cultural domain? In the rest of the conversation, I'll embark on, I hope, that a thought-provoking journey. And the ideas and arguments I put forward here are ones that I'm still tackling both as a practitioner, as a teacher educator, as an intellectual. I'll begin with laying out the major arguments and then grounded some analytical work. My goal is to unravel the inherent secular nature of language education, whereby the very context and texts are shaped by prevailing secular images, imaginaries, narratives. And this exploration prompts us to question whether the ostensibly intercultural nature of language education is in fact influenced by a more homogeneous worldview. And it has implications for the very limits of the concept of inclusion and diversity. And it asks, what are the terms and conditions of inclusion? And on whose terms do we include? And on whose time do we include? The overarching argument of the work is that there is a universal and secular vision of the human embedded in language education. And I'm making this as a blanket, more like a larger argument. Part of it also relies on my learning English in a remote part in center of Turkey, in Konya. While the argument needs empirical verification for other language contexts, my starting point is the way in which this universal secular human is imagined and to a certain extent fabricated in Turkish curricula, and contextualizing this in a way secularity plays out in Turkey. The secular vision of the human, while striving for inclusivity and difference, inadvertently constrains possibilities of alternative forms and systems of thinking, feeling, acting. So I'm going to start with defining some of the terms that I will be using. And these definitions are contingent, temporary. It's something that I'll mention because the concepts change along with, and Talal Asad says, concepts are intertwined with modes of being. As modes of being change, so do these concepts too. So I'm temporarily relying on these definitions. Dressler et al., they've relied on the work of Talal Asad and other post-colonial authors and the work in Islamic studies. They distinguish between the terms secularism, secularization, and secularity as follows. Secularism is characterized by institutional separation of politics or the state from religion, along with ideological legitimation. This denotes a more deliberate effort to create distinct boundaries between religion and political spheres within a society. It's a more traditional definition of secularism. Secularization, on the other hand, encompasses processes involving functional differentiation, religious decline, and a privatization of religious practice. It reflects broader structural changes in a society where religion gradually loses its influence in various aspects of public sphere. And this is an argument, like an old Weberian argument. And most Turkish historians still, I think, rely on the sort of gradual secularization thesis. Secularity, though, as defined, it pertains to fundamental cultural and symbolic distinctions, as well as institutionally anchored forms and arrangements, and differentiation between religion and other social spheres and practices. These may be linked to secularist ideologies in certain historical circumstances, but they may also arise independently, end of quote. The contingent definition of secularity allows to eschew more rigid uses of secularism as separation of state and religion, and helps us understand that these concepts are very much intertwined with modes of life as embodiment, as argued by Talal Asad. And as modes of life change and shift, so do the boundaries of these concepts. Assad argues experience and expression of secularism are deeply embedded in specific sociocultural contexts. Some actually use in Islamic studies, they use Islamic secularity. So challenging this idea that secular subjectivity is universal or universally applicable. And finally, an examination of the interplay between religion and secularity is inherently intricate, and I'm aware of that. And that such an analysis cannot be simplified into a binary classification of religious, non-religious, and religious or secular. And I'll give you an example. There was this author, I was trying to remember his name. He was writing for Cumhuriyet, the Republic. Yeah, it's one of those newspapers that I would say kind of takes secularism as one of these ideological core values. Yeah. And this author, I was actually surprised how they actually allowed him to write for Cumhuriyet. He used to have these brilliant cultural analyses about the sort of the changes in the behaviors and dispositions of Muslim youth in Turkey. Contrary to this, now especially in Turkey, there is a secular outcry that religion and the conservative values are kind of dominating both the politics and people's lives. And contrary to that secular outcry, he said, if you actually look at where the Muslim youth are spending their time and how they're spending their time, it doesn't necessarily explain that cry or that concern that people are getting more religious. So if you look at their practices, their material practices, the time they spend in virtual or non-virtual environments, and the spaces, where they spend their time, it is not necessarily becoming more religious in a sense. So this kind of helped me to explain that notion of secularity or religiosity, and that the concepts can be a little bit blurry in a sense, so that you can't really separate the two easily. For the data sources, most of my analysis will be of this particular book. It's called Istanbul. Now, Turkish is one of those less commonly taught languages, so there are not a lot of what you say comprehensive curricular material. This is one of those more a complete set of textbooks. It has from novice level to advanced levels, and it is commonly used in Turkey to teach international students and also in more European contexts. I don't know if any language teachers are using Istanbul here. I did not when I was teaching. And secondly, I'll share some of the findings from that study that I mentioned and that a colleague of mine and I did. So I'm going to start with my analysis. Now, to trace secularity in the textbooks, you don't have to look for ideologies or the author's intentionality, but really analyze how the mundane is presented and represented. Basically, the daily organization of time, the spaces or the places these characters spend their time in, and this alone demonstrates an immense asymmetry in the way secular images and narratives are mobilized to present and represent the cultural domain. The organization and presentation of daily life, particularly within the first 3 books, the elementary and the intermediate levels, reveal a conspicuous one-sided and asymmetrical mobilization of secular images and narratives, coupled with a discernible manipulation of temporal arrangements and spaces and spatial configurations, to the extent that any authenticity of human experience is in a predominantly Muslim country is sacrificed in favor of cosmopolitan and secular experience. And I'll give some examples. So temporally, in terms of how they're organizing time in the book, there's a notable uniformity that pervades the characters' daily routines, emphasizing a linear, homogenized passage of time in an urban environment. In a unit titled Benim Dünyam, My World, in the first book, the book introduces various characters and their day-to-day activities. Yeah, for example, there's a family of Sevim and Halis with 2 kids living in Beşiktaş, a famous Istanbul neighborhood on the European side. The mom is a teacher, the dad is a doctor. There is Anar from Kazakhstan studying Turkish in Istanbul with his friends Milena, Olga, and Hasan. Anar loves spending time with his friends and traveling around Istanbul. There is Lisa, who's introduced writing an email to her family, and she lives in a dorm in Fatih, another well-known Istanbul neighborhood. Her activities include eating out with friends after school, traveling in Istanbul, and shopping. And finally, there is Fatima from Iraq, similarly in the same Turkish program as Anar. She is one of the few women with a headscarf introduced so far. And interestingly, there are 2 women introduced with a headscarf so far. Both of them are from other Muslim countries, yeah. So one is from Malaysia and the other from Iraq, yeah. Neither of these are from Turkey. Fatima wakes up early, washes her hands and face, gets ready to go to school. They sometimes have breakfast together, but sometimes they wake up late and miss breakfast. Then they leave the dorm and take the tram, which is very crowded. That is during rush hour. This is probably the only where you say like a real human experience. Then she narrates how the language experience is so fun. They visit various places in Istanbul, and then she returned to the dorm. And as you go through these narratives, you notice there is much repetition in the way characters narrate their daily activities, which obviously serves a linguistic function. Yes, so those of you who are language teachers, we do this a lot. Introducing and recycling language patterns, vocabulary, so that language learners are exposed to the linguistic input in different narratives. Or rather, same narrative, just different characters. However, in doing this lip service to the linguistic patterns, the text risks homogenizing the human experience and the very ostensibly different characters and narratives. And the homogeneity is achieved through the way time is organized and where the individuals spend their times. Yeah. And in these, you can actually replace Anar with Lisa, Lisa with Fatima, without losing any sense of identity, as it is not the human experience, yeah, but the linguistic repetition. And the emphasis on linguistic repetition overshadows the unique phenomenological experiences of these characters, placing the acquisition of grammatical structures at the forefront, thereby prioritizing psycholinguistics. Yeah, so acquisition of language becomes the priority in this case. The seemingly diverse characters, paradoxically, contribute to the text homogenization and in a very secular structure too. Because they all engage in an identical mundane activities, and I'm using mundane in both sense, yeah? That's the ordinary, at the same time, the worldly. Obliterating any kind of nuanced differences. Notably, even Fatima from Iraq and her religiosity, which is symbolically present through Islamic attire she is wearing, remains conspicuously absent in the narrative, yeah? So basically all the characters are kind of engaged in almost the same type of activity. Their time is similar and their spaces are similar. I think most of us wonder what Fatima or Lisa would really experience in Istanbul. it's a very cosmopolitan and quite disorienting city for both Muslim and non-Muslim students from abroad. And I lived in Istanbul for my dissertation for about 3 months. And I used to I loved the city, but I hated it every single day, for various reasons. So we really want to know how they would really feel about their experience. Yeah, the new encounters with the environment, with the people, the language, the experiencing of the disequilibrium or the disorientation, which is at the very core of studying abroad or studying a language. Yeah, so that real human experience basically kind of sacrificed in favor of repeating the language and narrative through different characters. Spatially, in terms of the use of space, the text orchestrates a one-dimensional landscape where characters navigate through environments that lack depth and complexity. When Melek, for example, introduces her mahalle, which is this map is a representation of her mahalle. Mahalle is kind of it's hard to find the equivalent of the term. Yeah, it's like a social, it's a neighborhood. So it kind of denotes a space, yeah, neighborhood, but also it's kind of a social unit, yeah. And so it's both, it designates a particular space, particular location, but also a kind of sociality. And I think that the best term that I found was probably neighborhood. So Melek introduces her mahalle, and Unit 6 titled Our Environment and Us. Her mahalle bears resemblance to any middle-class, relatively safe, and somewhat sterile neighborhoods found in cities like Chicago, Barcelona, maybe Lisbon. Within this peculiarly familiar setting, Melek engages in activities typical of a tranquil suburban lifestyle. Yeah, so her hobbies include leisurely walks in the park adorned with trees and walking paths, breakfast at a local cafe, and shopping at a nearby center. And I think the book was written before the economic crisis. Yeah, there's a lot of shopping in the book. And then she also attends the theater. You can find everything in my mahalle, she proudly declares, listing amenities from gym and banks to a hospital and grocery store. Yeah, and despite this exhaustive list, and the list is here, a noteworthy absence is indiscernible. Yeah, unlike many Muslim mahalles in Turkey, there is no mention of a mosque or any kind of a religious space. Again, leaving a sort of conspicuous gap in the representation of that neighborhood. And when I was developing my unit for my Turkish class, I started what was familiar to me. You know, so the things I started with was a mosque, a bakery, and then we used to have a couple bakkal. These are like convenience stores, yeah, small grocery stores. There was a school about 1.5 miles away, and we used to walk to the school every single day. And then right behind our house, there was a graveyard. Yeah. So when I first introduced graveyard to my students, I was like, "What?" And a house next to a graveyard. But it also becomes a really good opportunity to talk about what you do around the graveyard. Yeah. And I remember playing soccer around graveyard. Yeah, I mean, it's a sacred space. Obviously, you can't play soccer on it. Yeah. But we used to play around the graveyard, and every now and then our ball would fall in. So when you're going to get your ball, you have to respect the grave. Yeah, you can't just step on it. But what I'm trying to say is that I'm developing a kind of a different relationship with the space. Yeah, it's helping me to understand that idea of respecting those who passed. And it is this kind of, I think this, especially in language education, is that kind of human experience that we're looking for. And I'm not just mentioning this to tokenize the conversation with a symbolic religious experience. And I think that's what happens a lot. So include a little bit of a religious here and there, and then all of a sudden we solve the problem. But rather, I'm actually talking about the depth and the complexity of human experience in relation to the space and how essential this can be for communicative action. And you cannot, and this is my argument, have a communicative action without understanding a complex relationship people build with time and space. And I give you another example of the structure of time. Yeah, my grandfather, he used to passed away a few years ago. His time didn't start at 7 o'clock. Yeah, he would wake up at 4:30 or 5 in the morning for the early morning prayer, and then he would recite qasida. I don't know the best sort of translation of it. It's more like an
Qasa'id?
yeah qasida, yeah.
Like, is it poetry?
It's a form of poetry in praising the birth of the prophet.
Oh,
So he would recite it for like half an hour, 45 minutes. Yeah, that was when his day started. It wasn't 7 o'clock or 8 o'clock. His day started at 5 o'clock. And the rest of the organization of time didn't rely on a particular sort of capitalist system. Yeah. And at 12 o'clock, we take a break. No, it was around prayers. That's how they structured their time. But the book does not complicate that structure of time. And this is why I say, we don't look for ideologies, look for these material practices, how people organize their time. And this is the reason I say secularist time is very hegemonic. Yeah, it's kind of taking or sort of absorbing like a black hole, absorbing everything into it. And my grandfather used to kick me when he used to wake up. He used to kick me, to wake up and pray too with him in a joking way. He used to call me infidel. So what you see in these books, there is an effort to contextualize language teaching. Yeah, and this is obviously it's nothing new. Since the 70s, we've been talking about culture, contextualization, etc. So the books are, to a certain extent, contextualizing language, language structures, vocabulary. However, what we find is that the context often becomes sanitized and at times too familiar to the point of losing any kind of authenticity. And I know that authenticity is a problematic term. So the global familiarity, and I think they're trying to kind of make it accessible to the international student, to the extent that, again, that human experience, that human condition is reduced to kind of like a global experience. So in a sense, it inadvertently homogenizes the diverse cultural nuances that make language a rich and dynamic expression of human experience. And I'll give you another example. I was in Istanbul. I was taking the tram from, and I'm saying this because I used to love and hate every single day. So I used to take the tram to Istanbul University when I was meeting with someone. And at some point, a senior lady got on the tram, and there was this gentleman who stood up and offered a seat. And she started, at some point, she started sort of yelling and cussing at him, yeah? And she used terms that, or swear terms that I had never heard before, so I should have taken notes of it. But the reason I say that, again, it's, Fatima's experience in Istanbul, yeah, it's not all gloomy or not, it's not all happy and, this is what I did, I go shopping, yeah? It's that human experience that I had in that particular moment. You see a lot of things at the same time. You see elements of religiosity, you see elements of secularism, you see elements of surprise. And another day, we almost had an accident. The bus almost hit a place. And again, I share these about that complexity of the experience. That complexity of the experience of these international students is missed or is not brought up. So, when religious themes, products, and practices are incorporated into text, yeah, so there are times when these religious practices are actually included. But they are enveloped in secular vocabulary, diluting the identity and the depth of religious experience and spiritual meanings. In Unit 5, titled Zaman Zaman, which can be translated as at times, also like a nostalgic view of time past. There's a dialogue between two Moroccan characters named Hand, the mother, and Yusuf, the son. The conversation is about religious festivals and national holidays in Turkey. Yusuf is asked by the mom what people do during one of these religious festivals. And it's not really clear which religious festival it is. I think it is Eid al-Fitr, Ramadan Bayramı. And Yusuf reminisces about the time one of his Turkish friends named Ahmet invited him to his house. And here's how he describes what they did. The whole family put on their new clothes for the Bayram and the festival. After breakfast, children kissed the hands of the elders. The elders gave the kids money. Bayram aşıları. Ahmet and his family welcomed a lot of guests. They first served guests colonia. What is the best way to translate it? It's kind of cologne. It's a fragrance water, and then candies, and then Turkish coffee and tea. Ahmet's mother cooked special foods for Bayram and prepared special baklava. They were delicious. And their hands tadı damağımda kaldı. The conversation does not differentiate between national days and religious festivals. And the religious festival mentioned is stripped of any religious undertone. Now, for Muslims in Turkey and around the world, obviously, the Eid celebrates the end of Ramadan, the holy month of fasting. Most Muslims awaken before sunrise for the early prayer, obviously. And later the day includes charitable donations towards those in need, the zakat, or zakat. And there's large public gatherings for special Eid prayer, followed by celebratory family or community feasts, depending on where you are. You know, most urban areas is families gathering, but go to more rural areas, there's a more community gathering. And there's also giving gift. Yeah. But when I was little, actually, we also used to go, not a little, in the eastern part of Turkey, we used to go visit the, and those who passed, we used to go to visit graveyards on Bayrams too. The textbook dialogue omits the religiosity of the festival altogether. In a sense, this too becomes just another tradition, another important day. In the intermediate textbook, there's a unit titled The Wonders of the World. It's my translation. That introduces some of the iconic places around the world, such as the Colosseum, Golden Temple, Egyptian pyramids, and Sultan Ahmed Jami, the Blue Mosque. There's a listening activity at some point in the unit that asks learners to compare Mihrimah Sultan Jami, or mosques. These are the two mosques named after Mihrimah Sultan, the daughter of Suleiman the Magnificent. This listener section narrates briefly the history of these mosques, mostly factual information when they were built. The architect who was commissioned by Mihrimah Sultan to build these mosques, namely the great Mimar Sinan, the head architect of the palace, and some of their architectural features. To the listener's surprise, though, a good chunk of the listening section actually narrates a legend that involves the love story of Mihrimah Sultan. Or rather, Mimar Sinan's one-sided love for Mihrimah Sultan. And those of you who watch Turkish soap operas, you might actually be familiar with this story. I don't know if it was included, but I would be really surprised if it was not included in those stories. Anyway, so according to the legend, Mimar Sinan was in love with Mihrimah Sultan, but was not able to confess his love for her because she married someone else. So he expressed his love for Mihrimah Sultan in his, obviously, architectural genius, in the way he designed these two mosques. Yeah. So, they talk about this femininity of the facade of these mosques. They talk about the single minaret representing Mimar Sinan's loneliness, and the place of one of these mosques, obviously, further out in Istanbul, representing the leaving of Mihrimah Sultan. Yeah. Fascinating story. And of course, if you're a young adult in that classroom, you would be enticed by the story. It's a love story. I mean, who would hate it? Here are some of the comprehension questions asked at the end of the story. Who is Mihrimah Sultan? This is Mihrimah Sultan. This is one question. Who is the architect of Mihrimah Sultan mosques? There are some fill-in-the-blank type of questions with two choices, multiple choices. Well, two choices. And most of the questions are factual, what we call level 1, or sort of knowledge base. And then they relate to the legendary love story. In a strategic move, the textual narrative omits any references to the religiosity of the mosques, effectively transforming these into sort of secular historical sites and architectural wonder. And by suffocating any religious connotations that the mosques inherently embody, the narrative redefines their identity, emphasizing their historical significance and architectural prowess. And this omission acts kind of as secularizing force, distancing the mosque from its religious roots and functions and allowing it to be portrayed as a cultural monument accessible to a diverse audience. The narrative's focus on the historical and architectural facets not only alters the perception of the mosque, but also aligns with a broader cultural narrative that seeks to appreciate and celebrate the structure for its aesthetic and historical contributions, divorced from specific religious affiliations. In a way, we are asked to enjoy their aesthetic beauty without being encumbered by any religious connotations. So I'll sort of conclude my thoughts here, and then we can have a broader conversation. In analyzing Turkish language textbooks, and some of it based on my own experience teaching Turkish, we kind of observe a distinct pattern that is emerging. Textbooks either explicitly avoid incorporating religion or religiosity, decoupling it from the cultural context, or when religious practices and perspectives are introduced, they are often enveloped in secular vocabulary, stripped of any spiritual or religious connotations. And here are some of my kind of tentative discussion points. First, in the Turkish context, secularity and secularism, and I would say religion and religiosity, are deeply interwoven with modes of being, thinking, and feeling, forming a complex tapestry that extends beyond mere ideological, political, or legal frameworks. And this intertwining is particularly pronounced in the corporeal and visceral aspects of individual lives, yeah? So if you're secular, you embody secularism in a sense. You have to demonstrate it in some ways. Where secularity manifests through embodied expressions of identity. The aesthetic component of secularity is evident in people's actions, their attire, and emotional responses, yeah? So wearing a bikini or shorts could, I'm not saying they are, yeah, but they can be used as political actions or political stance, as expressions of political. Dressing in a particular form, the aesthetics of the body becomes a political expression in and of itself. And so secularism is intricately woven into the fabric of people's everyday lives. And any perceived attack on secularism, which is, and if you're following Turkish news, yeah, there's a lot on how the conservative government is attacking the foundational secular laws, yeah, and the civil code, and also this discussion of Sharia now in Turkey, kind of a replacement of secularism. There's a lot of kind of fear among seculars. Any perceived attack on secularism, not merely construed as political manure, so it's not just political, but as a direct assault on one's very way of life, yeah? So if you're embodying secularism, yeah, you don't see that necessarily as a change in the politics, but as an attack on yourself. So my tentative discussion point is that asymmetrical mobilization of secular images and vocabulary in these language textbooks and curricular materials reflect a social, moral, and aesthetic rationality that is a product of almost a state-sponsored and at times imposed cultural modernity in Turkey. My second tentative argument is that the dynamics of curricular materials, curricular choices in language education are intricately linked to the habitus of language teachers, who often embody a more middle-class and secular perception of life. Yeah, so this is partly supported by our study with world language teachers. So the choices made in curricular materials, instructional methods, and content delivery reflect educators' own cultural backgrounds, their social, political, and aesthetic dispositions. And thirdly, there is this lack of clarity among world language teachers, really, towards the status of culture and other associated concepts like religion. And I think it also has to do and it's something I bring up in the discussion, is we don't have a clear sense of like, what is the knowledge base for world language teachers? Is it psycholinguistics? Is it sociolinguistics? Is it linguistic anthropology? Is it cultural studies? And where and how we locate notion of cultures in this knowledge base. So I wanted to pause here and then open the room for conversations and questions. And then if we have time, I'll have some. I'll share some of the findings of our study with world language teachers. But I wanted to first, if you have any questions, or we can engage in a conversation about this notion of secularity and secularism in language curricula. So, any questions? Any?
I definitely have a question.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
Well, because and some of my, quite a few of students who like take Arabic here at UNC, but then also, Annika, you study Turkish here at UNC as well?
do.
You do.
I do.
You do. So it's very interesting, like working in these, sometimes Muslim majority contexts, and like our book incorporates religion. However, oftentimes it feels like it's a snapshot, right? And it's like religion is this lived experience. And so it feels like, okay, yes, it's handled, but like it's not handled well. And so I think I'm wondering, is there anyone that you've come across who is like making suggestions for how to, handle the topic of religion as it interfaces with culture in the world language classroom, whether it be in Turkish or Arabic or Portuguese or Spanish or, any of the languages, because all of these languages around the world have different faiths and religions that exist in those spaces and places.
That's a good question. I don't think there is any discussion of religion in world language education at all that I'm familiar with. There's a lot of discussion of culture, I think the Europeans are actually doing a better job in thinking about interculturality, intercultural competence, and incorporating culture, at a deeper level. So there's a lot of conversation. People like Michael Bayram has written a lot on, what do you do with culture? But I don't think there's, as far as I know, no discussion of religion or religiosity in world language education. But I think that is a critical question. And I think part of the problem is not just inclusion, but inclusion on what terms, on whose terms, If you're using secular vocabulary, and in this case, you're actually stripping off, whatever that religious meaning or the spirituality that is in it. So there's a problem with inclusion. Well, one is there's a problem of exclusion, not mentioning at all. And I think if you go through these books, the first 4 books are almost, you feel like you're in Turkey a little bit, but you don't feel like you're in a Muslim country, except for the units will start with an image of a mosque, but the rest of the unit doesn't mention the mosque in any depth at all, almost no mention of it. In the 5th book, there is just one paragraph, and it's interestingly brought up in a unit called love, and they bring in sort of Sufist.
The levels of love.
Well, not even that, just a little bit of like how Sufism and Rumi you sort of perceived love, what was love in his perception. But even that, it's kind of sort of put into a universal theme of love, So it's like there too, there are a lot of opportunities to actually talk about religion, and you don't have to include it in depth, but at least create that space for learners to be able to explore, But that too is absent. So I think your question, again, religion is in a world language context. Unfortunately, I am not familiar with. Go ahead.
So when I hear the word secularism, my mind immediately goes to secularist policies, particularly in France. And I was wondering, how do you think that secularist vocabulary in learning can affect secularist politics and policies?
They're very much intertwined, What I look for is the production and reproduction of secularism in daily life. And I think my concern is, obviously there is we can treat this at a political, at the structural level, but my concern is secularism becomes this hegemonic way of not just thinking, but acting and feeling, and the vocabulary to express your feeling too, And that is something that I think we should talk about. But the Turkish secularism it has a lot of connections with French secularism in terms of how the state positioned itself vis-a-vis religion, and at the beginning, the goal was actually to preserve and protect the state from religion, and that you can see again. So that is the ideological or the political understanding of it. now you see that is also a form of embodiment too. So you see again, like the politics are demonstrating or are shown through embodiment. And this is interesting. I don't know if you can actually see that in maybe I think if any colleagues doing work in Iran, it's pre-Islamic revolution, yeah. So the Iranian, especially secular Iranians' embodiment of secularism has kind of similar connotations, yeah. So it becomes really a self and individual protection in a sense, but it has obviously to do with the imposition of kind of that secular political rationality.
So I did come in a little late, but from what I got, it's like, especially in textbooks, in Turkish textbooks, it's very like divided between secularism and religion, and it's very one-sided, like doesn't include religion. And so as a person who's planning to study abroad there, how can I get like a bigger picture of that and become more aware since it's not included?
That's a really good question. I think the first thing, I mean, if you have the opportunity, obviously, I would travel a lot, not just to the tourist areas, yeah, but areas where you can actually meet and talk to people and observe. And also, going to the mosque, not just to observe, but see how, what people are doing and how they're relating to these places, yeah. So some of it, you might actually, it could be an individual kind of an exploration, yeah. The textbooks are, unfortunately, the textbooks that are used in Turkey, they will introduce Turkish, but they're really silent when it comes to religion. So, I mean, honestly, just living with a family, I don't know if you're living in a dorm, living with a family and then just trying to see, how they are kind of living religion, and even secular families, they have religiosity. It's not that they're non-religious. So that's just one way, reading, getting immersed in the culture a little bit more, and being observant to, the differences that you see. And one of the things I tell teachers, especially those who are teaching languages and cultures, I say, make that experience disorienting. Disorientation is critical, and it's critical for learning. Yeah, so you need to be disoriented, because in educational psychology, again, we use disequilibrium. Yeah, for mind to learn something, first it needs to be challenged. So just be open to be challenged in a sense, and disoriented. And our goal is when you come back kind of a different person, that it adds, not physically maybe, but culturally and intellectually, really adds and expands your body and your mind. That's the goal, yeah. But some people study abroad and come back as tourists. They love the monuments and everything else. And I think this is how some of the textbooks are actually treating cultures. They're like tourist images to be consumed in a sense. So yeah, that it was a feminist scholar, Sarah Ahmad, she uses the term sort of disorientation. Yeah, have as a queer person when you're walking into a space where it's not your space. Yeah, so that is the feeling of kind of disorientation. I'm using it in a more positive way. That is the beginning of learning. That's how I see it. Inquiry, yeah. You go ahead.
I'm struck by this new generation of textbooks that are trying to be sort of more realistic and give than when I was learning languages, and the textbooks were they made no real attempt to represent the place.
Yeah.
It was really learning the language was the focus.
Yeah.
And so now part of me thinks it's pandering to students who don't want to learn grammar. And so you have pretty pictures and you say, here are the fun things you could do with this language. But I guess on a more positive note would be that they are geared towards the use that's going to be made of them.
Yeah.
And so, if it's tourism and if it's shopping, then that's what their target audience wants.
Yeah.
And that to expect a cultural education from these books might be too much.
Yeah.
No,
that's a good question. Yeah. So that's a question that we ask too. Actually, there are some sociolinguists that say we might as well drop this whole notion of culture and focus on comparative skills They use intercultural competence, I use comparative consciousness. So we might, drop that and focus on skills, not just grammar, yeah. But skills for learners to navigate in these intercultural spaces. I still think that we need to have, whatever our definition of culture is, we need that context. That, because, again, if we talk about diversity, if we talk about inclusion, yeah, difference is at the core of, you might have a pragmatic function of, I want to learn English or Turkish to do business. That's a different setting. If our goal is intercultural understanding, yeah, intercultural competencies, then I think we need that cultural context. And I don't think we can have an intercultural understanding without a good understanding of the culture itself, yeah. But the question is, how much, yeah, these language curricula can do, and I think it's a legitimate question. But there is, I see, is kind of an intentional, maybe a sort of subtle ideology in the way the culture is being presented. That was my.
I was just gonna add to that too. I think like over the years, there has been that shift because studies have been shown, right? Like showing that the student who studies business and learns Mandarin, if they like just learn the language, but don't learn the nuances of how the language is used, they're a less effective business person, right? Like you build relationships and trust through your ability to connect and communicate with people. And if you can do that, I would say more effectively versus just like rotely, right?
Yeah.
Kind of like the Rosetta Stone, like je suis une jeune fille, right? I think that was like Muzzy or whatever it was called, but it's proven it to be more effective, which is why in Europe as well as in the United States, like critical intercultural competence is on the rise, as this has to be a goal and a skill that students are learning along with language proficiency.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I stole your question. Back right. Did you have a question? It wasn't your question, but I took yours.
No problem. My question is, you have been telling us how it is through various examples. Do you also have a suggestion how it should be, or do you leave it to us?
Do I have an alternative textbook or alternative resources? Not yet. But one of the first things that I did when I, after I was reflective work, I started to rethink about my curriculum, and I started to rethink about what images do I include. Yeah. So when we were talking about Mahalle, for example, I had two pictures for kids. One of them was a Levant kind of a Mahalle where you have these skyscraper kind of business kind of environment. And then there was also, I think it was like a Sulukule kind of a Mahalle, yeah. But the buildings are almost attached to each other. You have bakkal, etc., and you have kids playing on the street, yeah. So I presented both of these are Istanbul or Turkey, and then I shared my own street, yeah, growing up. So I did that individually, yeah, but we don't really have. There are some books in Spanish. There's actually a new Actful book that incorporates a lot of social justice themes, yeah. So instead of talking about things like, tourism and visiting mosques, etc., they talk about poverty. Why don't we? It's because if the goal is trying to explain, or if the goal is trying to understand another culture, another world, yeah, you don't have to focus on what is called, high culture, yeah. And so they talk about poverty, they talk about immigration, migration. They bring in stories of these poets or short story writers who have traveled from South America to the United States and bringing their experiences, yeah. So there are multiple ways we can rewrite this. The characters don't have to do shopping every day. That doesn't have to be the norm, yeah. And I know we like the activity of shopping, or the first thing that they talk about typically is washing your hands and faces. That's how the day starts, yeah. Most people probably don't start with washing their hands or faces. I mean, it's fine, yeah. But this is how, that's one way, ask students what they are doing when they wake up in the morning, yeah. And so bringing a little more human experience, and not just human experience that is kind of a middle class, upper middle class human experience. So there are resources in Spanish. I think most other languages, unfortunately, it's just that because the languages are not taught very often, maybe Chinese could be one of those languages, yeah, I don't know. They might have more resources now, but Turkish, we still don't have what you would call like a text that really has a more balanced kind of representation and presentation.
Pedro, what about you guys? Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Professor Yasin, for this fascinating talk. And thank you very much, Caroline, for organizing this. So many thoughts. So I'm a professor of Portuguese here at UNC. And I think that I'm not the only one. For me, my greatest joy is to shatter the expectations, the stereotypes, and the biases of students in the first class. So what do you think that Portugal looks like? And everyone has this image, and we love saying, no, it looks nothing like that, let me tell you. And I think that, if you have been teaching in a classroom and if you integrate cultural teaching with language, we all have this experience of the students trying to other the culture, so the othering, the exotification of the target culture. In Portuguese, everyone thinks that people ride horses, for instance, or are incredibly religious. But I'm sure that people who teach French are completely tired of talking about eating baguettes and cheese. So this is to say that there is, at least from my perspective, an interesting tension between pushing against the temptation of exotification. Use the word authenticity. There's an ambiguity between authenticity and exotification, othering the target culture, and at the same time remaining true to what because I think that we have a feeling that we must remain true to a certain kind of cultural expression that we understand is the culture that we want to bring to the classroom. As I was listening to your, I think that your fantastic argument about wrapping religiosity as culture, as a cultural artifact, I was thinking about something. I'm originally from Portugal and I teach Portuguese. Obviously, in no Portuguese textbook, Our Lady of Fatima is mentioned. And yet, it is probably, one of the most traditional, widely adhered to, and everyone in the world knows what Our Lady of Fatima stands for. Obviously, it's not mentioned in any textbook. Furthermore, if there's one thing that is the common thread across all the former Portuguese colonies, is the prevalence of Catholicism. They are all incredibly, overwhelmingly Catholic countries. And there's no reference to religion in the Portuguese textbook. So, and at the same time, I'm thinking, so could we change that? That'd be interesting, to have, to acknowledge at least the centrality of faith and religiosity. At the same time, I struggle with the idea that many people, especially younger people, in the countries that we talk about, they'll probably push against that. So how do you navigate this incredibly complex tension? Like, whose version of these cultures do we want to? Because there's a lot of people who would be like, no, I don't, yes, that's my grandparents, but that's not me. And one very last thing, I was very moved by when you mentioned your grandfather and the kind of schedules and routines that we usually teach. It's the same in the Portuguese classroom. Everyone wakes up at 8, goes to class, and then goes shopping, as everyone knows. But there's an interesting factor. I think that class is also a factor embedded in religiosity. It's like no one says yes. In Brazil, people will wake up at 5 a.m. and then they take the train for 2 hours, and then they take another train for 1 hour to get to work. Because it's not desirable. And I think that some of what we try to do in our classrooms also is to create a factor of desirability. But we want our students to go there. We want our students to want to go there, to study abroad, to keep taking the language, to study the literature. So in creating the factor of attractability, desirability, sometimes we do that filtering of, we filter out certain things.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to share that.
Yeah, no, thank you, and I appreciate that. No, I think, yeah, I call it sanitization, or filtering, yeah. One of the things I mentioned is, teachers, if that is your upbringing, yeah, and this is something I see is, middle-class teachers here too. If that is your upbringing, if you have certain ethics of, let's say, Protestant ethics of work, when you walk into the classroom, and this is Pierre Bourdieu talks about habitus or habitus, yeah, you have embodied your Protestant work ethics. When you walk into the classroom, that is the expectation you have, yeah. And if you have kids, black kids who don't follow that kind of work ethics, now there is a tension, but typically they become the problem to solve. I think that I want to really the points that you brought up, the tensions about over exotification, and we see many of those, in, kind of an internal Orientalist strategy. And I was talking to an Arabic teacher last year. She said she wanted to create a unit, and I said, okay, let's talk about the unit. She said she wants to talk with the Bedouin, family structures. And I said, why? She said they are interesting to the people, yeah. So yeah, I mean that really makes it exotic in a sense. But I want to use the term human experience and the diversity of human experience, and I think that should be our starting point, yeah. The human experience and the working class, and I worked in Los Angeles when I was at the college, and I used to wake up at 5 in the morning, walk through the streets. There were a lot of homeless people. Back then, I was also afraid of being, stabbed, yeah. But then it wasn't just me. A lot of brown, Latino people were on those buses going to work, yeah. So, that is a human experience, yeah. Why is that not a part of our conversation? So I think absolutely that culture, the class is for sure a part of the conversation and discussion. And again, the making it attractive, yeah, making the study of the language attractive, to the extent that that human experience gets lost, yeah, or just particular form of experience. So yeah, and I think I like the efforts these days, particularly that's coming from this more like social justice oriented work. There are parts of it that I critique as well, but I think it is at least, expanding our horizon of what human experience is and is like, yeah. So again, we have schools in Oregon. They're kind of implementing more of these social justice oriented texts. Actually, there was an Arabic teacher there too, working at one of the high schools. She said she's doing what is called community-based language teaching, and so she would take her kids to these communities where a lot of these new immigrants arrive. Yeah, so she would say, "All right, this is where we're going to use our language." So it's not just language; it's just becoming a part of that community. So there are other ways of doing this. Basically, I think this kind of response to your question too. There are other ways of thinking about language and making language, functional. Yeah, so it's not just giving you a list of vocabulary to memorize. And this is another thing. Language, and I actually want to start with language teaching with the experience of an immigrant person in a new context, yeah, not to the experience of a tourist, because as a tourist you have a dictionary that you walk with a dictionary, yeah, but an immigrant, a person with what is the undocumented immigrant, they don't have a dictionary. There are conditions of life they're experiencing, and they have to know the language to solve that problem. So this is why I go back to that human experience. That should be at the core of what we do, yeah? And not the textbook, not the list of vocabularies. And maybe our starting point should be that. But again, if you're teaching it, higher education institution where a majority of your students are kind of middle class, upper middle class, and if you have those tensions, it's hard to balance it. Yeah.
I just wanted to add a comment that I think, it's not only, right, the culture that we're portraying, but also we have a lot of students coming into our classrooms every single day, right, who might have a cousin who's Turkish or Arabic or Portuguese, or a friend, or they might have been born there and then moved over to the United States. And so like, I really feel as an instructor, when certain aspects of the human experience are missing from this textbook, and I'm asking a student who's connected to that human experience to engage with this thing that like omits them and omits their experience, it feels like an injustice against the student. Like, and it feels like an exclusion. Or, I'll have students say to me, well, this is how I do it, like with my grandma, who might be Lebanese, but I don't see this in the book. Is that right? Is that okay? And it's as if they're asking if that's valid.
Yeah.
And like in those moments, I'm like, of course it's valid. And I'm so sorry this is not reflected in the curriculum. Like you are valid, right? Your experience is valid. So I think it's not just, okay, what will happen when the students go to that country and interface with those cultures or interface with those cultures in this community. It's how are you impacting their sense of like self-worth and self-regard and their validity as a human being. So that's why it's so critical.
Absolutely. Oh, go ahead.
My take would be, whose experience we're going to incorporate. I mean, people are coming from very different backgrounds. I mean, like, you're coming from I'm assuming rural background, and like
Rural-ish.
The thing is that nowadays it's like 30% of people living in the rural setting and more people living in urban setting. So like urban persons would be more general, but like would it be cultural? I mean, in 2024, cultures have become very homogeneous. I mean, most of us going back home and watching Netflix, and there's no culture over this. So like whose experience we're going to add into that, and on the religious side, like the I don't know, well, he told about the Portuguese experience, and like I would be okay with like learning Portuguese, but then like that Catholicism aspect enters into the learning experience. Like I'm not a Catholic. And that would be like, am I getting preached for this or not? That's like, that's a very thin line over there. And that could actually push people away from learning the language for fun's sakes and more towards like, well, okay, I'm not going to take this book and open it up. So I think it's a fine line to distinguish.
Well, it's, of course, I mean, every time you talk about representation, it is problematic. I mean, there is no easy solution of saying this is the representative, But again, I go back to the definition of human experience, and I don't agree that. But I think that there is this global, for sure, consumption culture that is relatively similar. But I don't think that is what we should be looking for, not similarities, but also the differences, the way people make sense of, even like Netflix, the way we consume Netflix, the way it becomes a part of our lives. When you look at the micro practices, I don't think you see a lot of homogeneity. You might actually, but I think your question about religion, I don't think, like the way I mentioned it, I don't think we should, start to police every book and say, no, this is not religious, etc. If religion is a part of that human experience, what I'm saying, you cannot exclude it. But in also secular environments, you have to be neutral in a sense when it comes to religiosity. Partly, and in the United States too, you can't preach it or indoctrinate people. But there's nothing that could tell a teacher not to include religion as, like when you're talking mosque, I mean, how can you exclude not talking about Islam? Does that make sense? So it's not just an architectural monument. That's what I'm trying to say. And it doesn't require a lot to have that conversation. And it is not indoctrination. I'm not telling you to be Muslim or Catholic, but I'm saying is, if we're talking about that experience, Catholicism is a part of that experience. One of my big shocks coming to the United States was learning about evangelicals and how strong that movement is in the politics in the United States. And even not that, like, you come with the image or the Hollywood image. And I'm married to someone in the United States. Even the secular denominations, like Unitarianism, when you actually start to live with people, religion is actually a big part of their, and I'm talking about liberal as denominations like Unitarians, yeah. It is a part of them. So for me, a big shock. That was one of those big shocks, yeah, because that's not at a part of the conversation at all. We have this kind of, that's what I'm saying. We have this cosmopolitan sense, or cosmopolitan self that eats McDonald's or goes to Starbucks and stuff. And this is true too. In Istanbul, a lot of people go. I mean, we used to go to McDonald's too. But yeah, it goes back to that question of how do we balance it? And I don't have an easy answer to that.
No, I mean, I can add to that actually, like in terms of experience. I mean, you mentioned your grandfather, and like my great grandfather was an imam in the mosque.
Yeah.
But also he was an alcoholic too, in a very odd sense. Like
That is the Turkish secular Islam. Yeah.
So that's like, what type of a story are we looking for, like in terms of, especially like a country like Turkey, where like from east to west, so many different like lifestyles out there. So it's
But if you're a language learner, wouldn't you want to know about that complexity and how people in Turkey are making sense of the East and the West, how they bring that traditions and modernity, how they kind of play with these in multiple ways. I would be interested in that, not necessarily going to Starbucks and eating. I'm just saying this, but for sure, like that is the human experience that I'm talking about. There is no single image of that human experience, And I think that, alcohol and use of alcohol, and again, this is they call like Islamic secularism. The way secularism is kind of enveloped in Islamic culture. So that's one way of talking about that experience. Anyway, that's a good point. There's not an easy answer.
It is for that, and I was just thinking, speaking about the centrality of religious words in American culture, for instance, versus I think there's one thing that most European countries and Turkey has in common was about 100 years ago, a very swift secularization political move that never existed the same way in the United States. So I was thinking, and in both the Spanish manuals and in the Portuguese manuals, the word God is never taught up until level 7. And I don't know how is it in Turkish? I never taught one of my students up to 4 semesters, which is 2 years studying a foreign language. They don't know the word because I don't utter that word in class. When I was learning English, you see the bill, the $1 bill, and the word God is there. So you learn it immediately. But in other languages, like, I never taught that word. I've been teaching.
That's interesting.
We have a God phrases lesson in like the first couple of, and it's speaking about how God phrases like inshallah, alhamdulillah, like God willing. It's speaking about certain phrases that have become so common, they become cultural and are not necessarily considered exclusively religious when you say it, right? Like phrases like you sneeze and I say, God bless you, right? You kind of, someone has to pause and think like, oh shoot, that has religious like backgrounds or connotations if you grew up in the States, right? But that lesson is like very early on. I mean, that lesson's in Alif Ba. It's like a couple weeks into an Arabic curriculum. And those phrases, like we use them all the time in class and like, I'm not Muslim, I'm not religious. But I use inshallah every like 10 times a day, in class. So
it's a part of cultural vocabulary too, but also that is where like the secularity and religiosity they're sort of intertwined, because there is obviously religious undertones to those
for sure.
vocabulary, but they also become so much a part of the culture, and seculars we use all the time without necessarily having that religious undertone.
It was my experience as well when I was learning English. There was no unit about the religious acts and the materials part of the religion. Like, for example, we asked our teachers, in Turkish, how do we say to pray? Like teach us the word to pray in English, and or to fast, or like what's the beats that like people do. Like how to say this in English, and because it's not part of the book, English book, Oxford.
That's what I studied too.
So,
Yeah.
but it's also not part of, Islam is not the religion of the English people, so it's normal. But in Turkish especially, it's like part of the Turkish people's religion, so it's very useful to know it.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, no, I mean, even in English textbooks, and I studied, this is part of my argument too. I studied I think it was called Hotline. I studied English through Hotline, and then there was double take, I think that was one of those. And yeah, we used to learn about these